So good morning. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thank you for joining us today for our Business Over Breakfast webinar series, which in the month of October is focused on embracing change in the new normal. In this new reality, our goal is to help people and organizations move from surviving to thriving. And despite the challenges, there are significant opportunities, and our presenters this month are going to explore some of those and how to take advantage of them. Last week, we heard from Tom Smith, our expert on the economy, discuss the economic realities and disparities we are faced with. And I still have that diagram with the K recovery close by. This week, we're pleased to have Dr. Steve Shepard with us to discuss the myriad of technologies we can leverage beyond the tools we have already become accustomed to, like Zoom. And later this month, we'll discuss how we can effectively and proactively lead and inspire change on our teams, how you can use rapidly pivoting business models to take advantage of the current market, and finally, how to create diverse, inclusive work environments on your teams and in your organizations. And that's really doubly challenging and doubly important at this time when there's so much flux and change going on. COVID-19 has drastically changed how we work, live, interact with others, and the impact on organizations has been no exception. Understandably, many decisions at the start of the pandemic were reactive and focused on stabilizing organizations in the midst of many, many unknowns. However, as we've adjusted to the new normal, it's become clear we're in a position to make many proactive decisions as well, to see this as a time of experimentation and learning, and as an opportunity to embrace change, set new goals, and step out ahead of the curve. Today, Dr. Steve Shepard is going to dive into just a few of the technology opportunities we have at our fingertips. Steve is truly a jack of all trades and an innovative thinker, and much of his teaching has centered on reverse engineering the future. He's also an accomplished writer, speaker, photographer, and in his own words, and I would agree with this, a technology demystifier. He's consulted domestically and internationally with clients representing a wide array of industries to develop competitive strategies, sharpen technology and marketing skills, and build technology infrastructure. He has pursued these passions across more than 90 countries, I think including Australia, and founded the Shepard Communications Group to tie all of his skills together to help organizations tell their unique stories. We're very lucky to have him here with us today as we consider what opportunities there are out there beyond Zoom. So just how this session is going to pan out, Steve's going to spend the next 35 minutes exploring the series of technologies, where their power lies and how we can leverage them within our organizations. And then the session will be followed by Q&A. So please write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and our team will do their best to get all of them to Steve to answer during the session this morning. At the end of the session, there's going to be a short 5-question survey, which we really ask you to fill in. It's very quick, but it's very important for us. So thank you, Steve. I'm looking forward to the session this morning, and I look forward to meeting you all up again next Thursday morning. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Nicola. I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good morning. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me bring this up. Hopefully you can see that. Let me make a couple of quick comments about what I'm really going to do here that kind of build on what Nicola just said. My goal here is to go through a series of technologies that everybody's hearing about these days, but we aren't necessarily aware of what they really are. And there's so much myth and legend around some of these things that I thought I might spend some time dispelling it. My goal is not to turn you into an electrical engineer or a bit weenie or a propeller head or even Sheldon Cooper. My goal here is just to give you a sense of what some of these tools are and what they're really capable of and where they may lead us down the road. As always, you'll have my contact information. If you have questions about any of this stuff, all you have to do is send me an email and I will be glad to bury you until you tell me to stop about additional information. So let's talk about swimming in a sea of technology. A lot of you may remember the days of school when you had to learn about this thing that was called the periodic table of the elements. Well, I'm sorry to bring it back up, but I want to show you a new one. A colleague of mine, a good friend, and I developed what we call the periodic table of the future. And basically what we did was we took a look at all of the technologies that are banging around in our heads these days and appearing in the media and so on. And we had started to look at them in the same way that Mendeleev looked at elements when he built his table back in the 19th century. And our goal was to say, what do these have in common? And ultimately what we ended up doing was grouping these technologies into periods, into columns, as he did. And those columns are artificial intelligence across the top of the screen here, cyber, computing, communications, Internet of Things, analytics, realities, and then that most elusive of all, the human elements. And the reason we did this is because we began to note that there were patterns emerging. And those patterns were eerily reminiscent of patterns that we see in chemistry. For example, as you all know, the compounds or the elements that are in various columns tend to have common behaviors. And we started to see that in a lot of these technologies. So we grouped them. And when we began to group them, we also began to see another commonality with chemistry. And that was that when you combine a technology in one family, if you will, with a technology in another family, magic things happen. You know, if you look at chemistry, for example, if I take sodium metal and I drop water on it, it is exceptionally volatile. It explodes with enormous force. If I take chlorine gas and expose it to something that's alive, it will very quickly become not alive because it's horribly, horribly volatile and poisonous. But if I take sodium and chlorine and put them together, I get table salt, which is a little bit more useful to those of us that, like food. Well, the same thing is true with technologies. It's nice to be able to look at any one of these technologies and be able to describe it. But anyone that knows how to use Wikipedia can do that. I'd like you to tell me about, artificial reality. Okay, great. I can go look it up and tell you what artificial reality is. But what happens when I combine artificial reality or virtual reality or augmented reality with broadband connectivity? That's where the real magic happens. And that's the way I want you thinking at the end of this presentation, okay? So think about it that way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of these so-called functional molecules, and I'm going to go over a few things that are common to each one of them so that you can start to develop a sense of what's really going on here. So with that, let's get started, and we're going to talk first about the cyber family. So in the cyber family, we find a lot of things. We find blockchain, and we find a variety of issues related to security. So let's set aside blockchain first. Most of us know that blockchain is a technology that originally came out of the dark web, that seamy, seedy part of the internet that we whisper about because that's where bad things happen, and that's true. However, blockchain is a technology that is so extraordinarily capable that it is now being used by more than 40 major international banks around the world as their highly secure, transparent ledger technology. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If you and I were to enter into a transaction where, for example, I'm going to sell you a camera for $500, okay? You're going to pay me $500, I'm going to give you a camera, and we enter it into blockchain. Well, the way blockchain works is that it prevents you, for example, from going into blockchain without my knowledge, accessing the sale agreement and changing the $500 to $1,000. I get notified instantly if any change in the chain occurs. Now that's a very simple example, but imagine what happens if you're a large business doing business with many, many, many different entities, any one of which could do something nefarious. Well, blockchain prevents that from happening, and it's a very complex but very capable technology that now has in fact become mainstream and is quite important. Let's also talk about the whole issue of security in general. Privacy, confidentiality, and so on, risk are all elements that we have to think about. And what's really critical here is that one of the observations that has been made repeatedly over the years is that a secure system is only as secure as the least secure person in the system. Let me give you an example there. I recently completed the publication of a new book with a colleague and friend of mine named Gary Kessler. The book is called Maritime Cybersecurity. And the reason we attack that particular dark corner of the cybersecurity world is because maritime is one of the most vulnerable areas in the business domain, and yet one of the most important. Think about it. Ports, those big container ports where they lift off the containers from ships and reload them, are by definition open and therefore vulnerable. You can't close the gate on a port. Well, if a sailor hops off of a ship when they pull into port, turns on their phone and connects to the port's Wi-Fi, and that phone is infected, well, now the port's Wi-Fi network is infected and potentially the systems connected to it if the person that built the invasive technology is any good at what they do. Not only that, but if you think about it, these ports tend to be multimodal, which means that not only is the port infected, but now any multimodal transport elements like trucking or trains or aircraft systems are now also infected. And it becomes this viral spread of technology. So my point is that it is critical for organizations today more than ever before, because the threat profile is so broad. It is critical that we pay attention to cyber and recognize that typically the most vulnerable place is the people that are using the system. One of the most common things we see is something called zero trust policy. And what that means is, for example, you have a CEO of your company whose job is to be the CEO. That means they don't get involved in technology stuff, typically. Right? But if they want to, your job as the technology leader is to say to that CEO, with all the love in my heart, you're an extraordinary CEO, but you have no business reason whatsoever to get access to the technology. Therefore, I'm going to deny that access. That's a zero trust policy. It says, you do your job, I'll do mine, we'll maintain separation, and that will add another layer of security on top of our organization. All right? So you want to be aware of cybersecurity requirements. That's just a given. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk now about the world of artificial intelligence. In 1950, the very first conference on artificial intelligence was held at Dartmouth College. People that attended were the best and the brightest that we had. People like Marvin Minsky and Claude Shannon and some of the most famous researchers in technology in the world. And that year in 1950, the journalists, of course, attended, and they were routinely asked by the journalists, how long will it be before we have a machine that is capable of thinking and acting like a human being? And they said with great confidence, 20 years. Well, we didn't hit that number. About 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to have a conversation with some of the best and brightest of today's artificial intelligence research world, and I asked them the same question. How long will it be before we have a machine that's capable of behaving and speaking just like a human being? And they said 20 years. So probably we just haven't gotten that far yet. The point is that this human behavior thing by machines remains quite elusive. Yes, they can do some interesting things, but they're still very limited in what they're capable of doing. For example, some of you may be aware that a supercomputer not too long ago with a very sophisticated artificial intelligence engine running in it actually defeated the world champion Go player. Now, Go is a game from Asia that is considered to be many orders of magnitude more complex than chess, and yet a computer beat the world champion at Go. However, if you ask that same computer to play checkers, it would have no idea how to do it because it is a highly specialized machine. And this is the key, that a lot of these systems are very, very good at what they're designed to do, but they're not general purpose thinking machines. Okay, so just something to be aware of. But let's continue on with a couple of the interesting stories about this stuff. Okay, Facebook had an interesting dilemma not too long ago. Now, Facebook is one of those controversial companies that, you either hate them or love them. There's very little in between. But one of the things I like about Facebook is that they have a very sophisticated artificial intelligence and robotics laboratory. And the reason they do a lot of research in the field is simply because these are technologies that they use to help run their advertising engines, okay? Well, a few months ago, Facebook had an interesting experiment going on where they had taught one of these intelligent machines in their laboratory to do a very sophisticated task. And they wanted to test it to see how good it was at doing the task. So they set it to do a job that was very ambiguous in terms of its outcome. It wasn't a binary yes/no outcome. And this made it very difficult for the machine by design. So they set it off running over the weekend. And the goal was they would come back in on Monday morning, they would have a look at it, and they would discover that this machine either had or had not completed the task. Well, they kicked it off, they turned off the lights, they went home, they came back on Monday morning, they told the machine, tell us what your results were. And instead of giving them the relatively concise answer they were expecting, the machine began to spew out page after page after page of paper from the high-speed laser printer, the paper, each page covered with gibberish, just random characters. Well, they couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. They worked on it and worked on it and worked on it. They finally figured it out. They simply asked the machine. And what the machine told them was that during the process of trying to solve the problem, the machine had determined that English, which is the language in which it had been programmed, was a cumbersome and difficult and imprecise language to work in. So it decided on its own not to use English. It wrote its own language, which was much more efficient. And then here's the best part. It taught that language to the other machines in the laboratory so that they could collaborate on the problem. Facebook turned it off because they couldn't quite understand what the implications of this were. You know, this is not Skynet by any stretch of the imagination, but it kind of takes things to a whole new level, all right? Let's shift gears and talk about robotics. That Amazon Alexa thing in front of you there, I wonder how many of your homes now have Alexa asking you what I want. That Alexa thing there, these smart speakers as they call them, are actually robots. A robot we tend to think of as something that is sort of humanoid in shape with arms and legs and something that resembles a head. But in point of fact, a robot is nothing more than a machine that has the ability to respond to some sort of change in its environment. Doesn't matter what the change is. These devices certainly fall into that category. About a year and a half ago, I gave a talk to a group in South Carolina, and one of the things I said to them was that given the pace of development of these technologies, these smart speakers, which have machine learning and natural language processing built into them, I believe that sometime over the course of the next 5 years or so, that these machines will be capable of resolving one of humanity's greatest challenges, which is human loneliness. People that are shut in because they're elderly or they have a disability often find themselves in a situation where they become lonely, and these speakers could potentially resolve that. And in fact, in one particular case, they did. I got a call about 2 weeks after I gave the talk from a woman who had attended the program, and she said to me, look, my mother is in a care facility about 40 miles away from me, so I can't visit her every day, but I see her every weekend. So after hearing what you said about these smart speakers, I bought one. And I took it to her room and I installed it and I showed her how to use it. And I left. No, they're easy to use. She said the following week I came back, it was Saturday morning, and I was approaching her room. Her door was open. And I heard her say this. She said, Alexa, play Frank Sinatra. And of course, Frank came crooning out of the speaker. And then she heard her mother say as she approached the door, oh, Alexa, do you remember that time that Frank and I took that trip to Atlantic City and we saw Frank in concert and we had that wonderful dinner together? And this woman said, I just stood outside her door and cried because for the first time she had a regular companion. This is the kind of technological change that we're going to see happening, and it's a big deal. So keep an eye on this one. This is one of my favorites. Let's talk about analytics for a minute. You know, what's interesting about analytics is that we have the ability today to collect data at an unprecedented level. We've never had so much data, nor have we had the ability to collect it. But the data that we collect is only as good as the analytics that we unleash upon the data. And there are various forms. There are business analytics that allow us to collect information about how our business is performing, how our customers are performing. We can collect market intelligence and competitive intelligence. That's all very important. There's big data, which is still poorly understood, but it is data that gets analyzed in some very sophisticated ways that allow us to learn things that we never, ever would have anticipated before. In fact, one of the characteristics of big data is that we actually don't know what it's going to tell us when we ask the question. We don't know what the potential answer is going to be. In business analytics, we do the analytics and they're going to tell us one of three things. Sales are going to be up, flat, or down, and maybe some degree on each one of those. But with big data, we don't know what it's going to say. For example, one of the most famous big data stories, and the reason I have the UPS truck there in the middle of this circle is because UPS is a big data user. They do a lot of analytics. And one of the things they learned was when they asked their big data systems, how can we reduce our carbon footprint? Because we're a green company and we want to be as green as we possibly can be. The system went away and crunched on the numbers for a long time. And when it came back, it said to them, it's very simple. Eliminate all left-hand turns. You will never, ever see a UPS truck turn left unless it's the only way to get into a dead-end street. The reason is because in order to make a left-hand turn, at least in the United States and other countries where the cars drive on the right side of the road, in order to turn left, you have to stop and wait for traffic. Well, think about how many vehicles UPS has that are sitting there idling, waiting for traffic to go by. If you eliminate that by making 3 right turns instead of 1 left turn, it turns out that their fuel consumption goes down by millions of gallons per year, and the number of route miles they put on their vehicles goes down, which reduces their maintenance costs. These are the kind of things we see happening. And then, of course, we have the human analytics, which are the analytics that we need that bridge the gap between what it means to be human and what we need to do in order to stay connected and how we're going to use the technologies that are out there most effectively to do that. All right, let's talk about realities for a moment. You've all seen these things. You know, Google came out with their Google Glass for a while that sort of went down in flames because the market just wasn't ready for it. But the ability for us to overlay information on top of an image is extremely important. And you see an example of it in this picture. I hope you can see it. In this particular case, we're on a factory floor environment and a technician is holding up an iPad in front of a machine. And what the machine it does is some complex thing, but what the screen is showing is where the maintenance points are that this person should look at in order to make sure that the machine is doing what it's supposed to be doing. The implications of these technologies for things like architecture, engineering, medicine, and so on are extraordinary. So basically you see the real world, but overlaid on top of the real world is information that will allow you to do it better. An example that I've seen personally is a company that creates maps, 2-dimensional paper maps, flat maps of buried utilities. So for example, if you're about to dig up the street because you need to get access to a water main because you're putting up a new building, it's important to know where the water main is, but it's also important to know where the gas lines are and the power lines and cable and all the other buried infrastructure. Well, normally we rely on maps, and hopefully they're accurate. Sometimes they're not. However, with these new virtual reality applications, technician arrives at the job site, puts on their virtual reality glasses, activates the system, and when they look down at the ground, instead of seeing the pavement below them, they see a 3-dimensional view of what's buried below them. Every single facility labeled with information about what it carries, how deep it is, where its actual GPS location is, and who to call if you need to do some work on it. That's an exceptional thing. We're now seeing medical schools that are doing virtual dissection using this technology. This is pretty important stuff. And, you know, we tend to think of these visual technologies when we think of things like Pokemon, for example, which is another example. But imagine having a heads-up display in your car that would display information on the inside of your windshield as you're driving down the road. These are the sorts of things that we're going to increasingly see. Kind of an interesting phenomenon. Then we get into the whole world of the Internet of Things. Now, the Internet of Things is kind of cool because IoT is one of those technologies that most people don't quite understand. Think of it as a next generation barcode, all right? So barcodes gave us the ability to track a package, for example, unless of course the barcode got mud on it or got torn or whatever it may be. Then we went to radio frequency identification, RFID. You've all experienced RFID. You've ever walked out of a bookstore and set off the alarm because the clerk forgot to deactivate the sticker on the inside of the book. We've all had that happen. Well, this is the next generation. And the thing about IoT is that the Internet of Things is nothing more than a network of connected things where the things are simply sensors that have the ability to spew out lots of data. Okay, that data gets spewed out and collected. It gets transported to a data center where it gets analyzed. The analysis yields insight, and the insight allows us then to take action. What kind of action? Well, let's imagine that you have a city that has been completely encrusted with these IoT sensors. We call this the smart city. Let's imagine now that you have the ability to reduce your power consumption such that streetlights only come on when a pedestrian approaches them. Okay, that's pretty cool, but that's not a big deal. Grocery store doors have been opening and closing when people approach them since the mid-1960s. So that's not something to impress people with. However, what if you had the ability to not only know when the light goes on and off, but to know how often it goes on and off, and in what areas of the town it's going on and off, and how many times a night it goes on and off, and how long it stays on? And has there been any crime reported in that area? And if the light came on, did at the same time that light trigger any cameras in the area that might be able to collect any kind of criminal activity going on? That's a smart city. What if you had the ability to put sensors in the sewer lines in the city so that you could collect data about the effluent to determine if there are any pathogens? Cities are already doing this. Cities are already stopping things like flu infections by noting that in one particular part of a large city, we're starting to see an uptick in the number of flu pathogens in the effluent, and they immediately take steps to get medication and so on to that part of the city. This is what a smart city is all about. Now imagine taking this into other areas. Imagine having smart universities and smart hospitals. And then we get into the whole game of smart agriculture. This is one of the areas I do a lot of work in. The thing I love about smart ag is that we now have the ability to take this IoT technology, use it in a small farm all the way up to a very large farm, and it gives us the ability to radically reduce our costs associated with things like seed and fuel and fertilizer and insecticide. In fact, in one particular case, there's a company that I do some work with, a company called Neo. Neo has invented a technology that is now being used in a lot of these kind of environments. And one of the things we've seen is that in at least one farm, a vineyard in southern Arizona that produces world-class grapes and wine, they've been able to reduce their water consumption at this vineyard by somewhere between 50 and 80%. Now, I want you to think about the implications of that in an industry where we typically flood the fields. They've been able to determine using these technologies exactly at what depth different species of grapevines drink, and therefore they only water to that depth. 50 to 80% savings in water. Think about the ecological implications of this. Big deal. And then we get into the whole issue of connectivity. So connectivity, whether you're talking about internet access, Ethernet, your telephone line at home if you still have one, or of course wireless connectivity, this is sort of Gollum's ring. This is the one ring that binds them all, because without a good, solid, broadband, ubiquitous, seamless network, none of these technologies work, because you got to have something that ties them all together, okay? So that's a really critical thing. And of course, today, one of the hot technologies that everybody's talking about is fifth generation wireless, so-called 5G. Let me just give you a little bit of reality here on 5G. 5G comes in two flavors. It comes in a low frequency flavor and a very high frequency flavor. The low frequency flavor, for those of you that are collecting this kind of information, operates in the 700 megahertz range, roughly about where Wi-Fi operates. And in fact, will give you over significant distances bandwidth similar to Wi-Fi, but no more than that, okay? The very high frequency stuff, which is up in the 40 to 60 gigahertz range, microwave range, way up there, where distance is short. You know, the higher the frequency, the shorter the ability to transmit. This will give you extremely high bandwidth. And you know, they talk about a gigabit per second and 10 gigabits per second. Who knows how much it'll be? It's bigger than Wi-Fi, but only over relatively short distances. I'm telling you this not to disparage 5G, because it's a very important evolutionary technology, but I want to make sure that you're thinking about it from a reality perspective. 5G is important, but if you want to be able to get very, very long distance connectivity at very high bandwidth rates, you're not going to get it unless we put in massive numbers of radios in highly congested areas like cities or amusement parks or stadiums or shopping centers or executive conference centers or universities. Then you'll be able to realize this. But the point is that 5G comes in these two distinct flavors, both of which are very useful, but you will probably bounce back and forth between them and with 4G as well, because 4G is already ubiquitous. It works very, very well. That's why you can watch movies on your phone or play interactive games on your phone. So just, don't get overly excited about what 5G is capable of yet. It's not here yet. We're still finalizing the standards and so on, but it is important and it's worth paying attention to. All right.
Steve,
yes.
Steve, we have a question come in that I'd like to share with you in the audience.
Absolutely.
So, when it comes to AI, how concerned should we be with invasion of privacy and related laws?
That's a great question. So artificial intelligence, of course, gives us the ability to really augment human intelligence, right? I mean, we tend to think of there's human intelligence and then there's AI. Actually, AI will become sort of an augmentation of human intelligence because it operates much faster than human intelligence does. Now, to the point of privacy and confidentiality and so on, does it give us the ability to do things that we didn't do before AI? Sure, absolutely. And we can do them faster and we can do them with greater nuance and so on. But the degree to which we guarantee privacy and confidentiality will fundamentally be a function of a couple of things. One, the degree to which we want those things protected. And number two, the degree to which we're willing to regulate the technology. This is an area that I spend a lot of time working on. I think that regulation tends to swing in a kind of a pendular motion. And right now I think we are moving toward we're kind of at the end of a pendulum swing that says less regulation is good. People tend to think of regulation as a bad thing. I don't. Whenever I hear the word regulation, I tend to pull that word out and replace it with the word protection, because that's what regulation is about. When they broke up AT&T, they didn't break it up because they were trying to be punitive toward AT&T. They were saying you have monopoly power, which prevents other players from coming into the game, and that stifles creativity. As soon as AT&T got broken up, within a few years, a modem that operated at 9,600 bits per second and cost $45,000, and I know because I used to install them, suddenly cost pennies because competition crept in. Well, the same thing is true now that we're starting to see the regulatory head coming up around things like Facebook and AI, Facebook and Amazon and a few other companies. So I don't see AI creating more in the way of invasion of privacy. What I see it doing is creating more nuanced uses of data that will be controlled by people in a way that will allow us to sort of control the degree to which it becomes invasive. And in fact, on the next slide, I'll show you one of the ways we're going to do that. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, send me another message or an email and I will come back to you with an answer. Anything else that we have out there?
Yes, Steve, we have our next question.
Cool.
You said that answers to questions, data output, is only as good as input, type of records kept. What does the question ask with relationship to quality of inputs and outputs?
Yes. Well, garbage in, garbage out, right? We've had that phrase forever. And so here's the kind of real answer to the question, because I think this is a really intriguing area that I love to talk about. When you look at big data, one of the things about big data is that it's not sole sourced data. In other words, we don't just look at your sales numbers. We don't just look at what the marketing information tells us. We don't just look at, data related to the spread of COVID, for example. What we do is we take that data and combine it with many, 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 many other inputs that have nothing to do with it. So for example, to go back to the UPS example, not only did UPS collect information about the route miles and how they drove and the speed and so on, they put sensors on their packages, they put sensors on the tires. In some cases, companies put sensors in roads to measure the wear of the asphalt so they could determine the best kind of coating to put on them. I mean, it was all kinds of things. That data gets combined and analyzed and yields these really, really sophisticated results. The point is that it will always be the case that the value of the output is only as good as the value of the input. However, given greater numbers of inputs, which have the ability to overcome the weaknesses of others, what we're finding is that big data and the sophisticated analytics that are associated with it, using tools like Hadoop, for example, and the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence, are creating increasingly more accurate results from data analytics, much more so than we've ever seen before. There's a very interesting experiment that was done not too long ago by one of the AI researchers who took a random collection of photographs of chocolate chip muffins and certain types of dogs that have short little noses. They look kind of like a chihuahua, little black eyes and short little noses. And they mixed them all together and they looked eerily similar. In some cases, you couldn't tell which one was a muffin and which one was a dog. But what they did was they took a machine that had computer vision and said, you tell us which one is it. And over time, as it made mistakes and learned and made mistakes and learned and made mistakes and learned, it reached a point where it was able to, almost without a single error, determine which one was which. So the machines have the ability to do very sophisticated analytics that we don't have the ability to do as humans because we don't have the speed. So when I said earlier that artificial intelligence augments human intelligence, that's what I'm talking about. What AI will never be able to take away are certain types of jobs that require things like strategic thinking or compassion. You know, we'll never be able to have them, at least not in our lifetime. We'll never be able to have a machine that can be a nurse, for example, because there is a quality there that is specifically human that is very difficult to create. And it's just not going to happen. So you know, that's a whole other discussion area, but it's a really interesting one. And it's something that I think we're going to see more and more of. So again, to kind of circle back to the answer to the question, the more sophisticated the analytics become and the greater the number of inputs that come in, the increasingly accurate the results will be, even when the inputs are vague or obtuse or in some cases opaque. Hope that answered your question. Anything else?
Yes, Steve. So can you please repeat the difference between the two flavors of 5G? And can you please address whether 5G will introduce health risks?
Okay, sure. So let me answer the last one first. Contrary to popular belief, 5G does not cause COVID. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, I can't even begin to imagine where that came from, but that's okay. One of the things we know about 5G is that the frequencies at which 5G operates, and this is one of the problems with 5G, the frequencies at which 5G operates are of a frequency and of an encoding type such that it will not penetrate human skin. It actually bounces off human skin. It also bounces off clothing, tinted windows, buildings, and so on. This is a problem because if you're walking around with a 5G phone and you want high bandwidth and the signal can't get to it because it's in your pocket, we have a problem. We either all have to walk around naked in order to use 5G, or we're going to have to figure out a way to have the antenna hanging out of our pockets. So let's dispel the health risks. Look, any radio broadcast of any kind theoretically has the potential to do something. We don't know what it is yet. There's a reason that microwave emitters, those things that look like a big bass drum that sit up on the top of cell towers and other towers, the reason those are way up there is because they operate within a frequency range that is very similar to the way your microwave oven works. The way microwave ovens work is really simple. There's a certain frequency of radio emission that excites the water molecule. So the H2O molecule, when it is struck by a certain wavelength of energy, it gets excited and it starts to vibrate. Well, when it starts to vibrate, it creates heat. And in a microwave oven, it cooks the food. That's how it works. That's why if you put a dry plate in a microwave and turn it on for 20 minutes, it's barely warm when it comes out. But you put in water or food, it cooks. Well, we're made up of water. So because those emitters are way up in the air, they tend not to be dangerous. I mean, because you don't walk in front of them, okay? So yes, radio waves can cause problems, but we have safety precautions that eliminate that, and 5G is not going to be an issue. Now, back to the original question about the difference. Very simple. 5G is two flavors. One of them is a low frequency version. One of them is a higher frequency version. And I've got, by the way, I've written some papers on this and I've done some podcasts on it. If you're really interested, let me know or let Emory know and we'll make sure that we get these into your hands. Happy to do that. The low frequency range, the one that operates down in that 700 or so megahertz range, is designed to give you lower bandwidth, but the ability to transmit over greater distances, which means that the distance between radios can be good. You think about it, when you're on your mobile phone, the radio that your phone is talking to is on a cell tower that might be miles away because the frequency at which it operates is relatively low. So it has a long propagation distance, okay? The other side of 5G, and this is the flip-flop part, is very high frequency, shorter distance, and we're talking about maximum maybe the length of a football field, okay? So about 100 meters or so, 300 feet, but very high bandwidth potentially. We're talking about a gigabit per second or more, very, very high. So, it's one of those good news, bad news things. So your phone will most likely, once 5G phones are available, and they're still minimally available because the service isn't out there yet, it's still very much in trial mode. If you think about it, your phone will have two radio chipsets in it. One will be the 5G for the higher frequency stuff, the other one will be for the lower frequency stuff, and it'll be smart enough to toggle back and forth. So if you go to an amusement park, for example, if you go to Six Flags and they have 5G high frequency established so that kids waiting in line to get on that ride can put on their VR goggles and ride the ride virtually while they're waiting to ride it for real, you'll be able to access it. But once you leave the park, right, because of the need to have those radios so close together, you're going to toggle over to the other version of 5G, or you'll toggle to 4G, depending on what's available in your area. Think about it this way. The last time you went to a parade, how did you know the parade was coming before you could see anything? And the answer, if you think about it, was you heard the bass drums. You heard the boom, 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 before you heard anything else. Those low frequency sounds travel farther than the high frequency sounds from the brass instruments, okay? That's the reason here. So that's the primary difference between the two. Hope that's helpful. Good?
We have another question here.
Alrighty.
You've shared a lot of details around these developments that are really exciting. Are there details around any of these developments that concern you a bit as we look to the future, outside of the social media, privacy, media influence topics that are currently on the horizon?
Yeah, but none of them are technological in nature. Every one of these technologies, like all technologies, offer a good side and a bad side. I mean, let's face it, people are really concerned, for example, about job displacement as a result of artificial intelligence and robotics. And I'm here to tell you there will be some jobs lost as a consequence of the implementation of those technologies. But they will be jobs that are horribly repetitive and boring that people don't want to do anyway. They will be jobs that are dangerous, hazardous. They will be jobs that, frankly, people simply should not do. They will also spawn the creation of a whole new set of jobs. So, for example, as we start to see artificial intelligence and big data and robotics implemented, we're going to need people who know how to maintain them, design them, program them, troubleshoot them, install them. None of those jobs exist today. With big data, one of the most highly demanded people, fields, careers, whatever you want to call it, interestingly enough, and we can't find these people, are people that have degrees in industrial psychology, because industrial psychologists bridge the gap between the work world and the human world. They look at it from two different perspectives. And what this data tells us is that there's an increasingly narrow gap between humanity and technology. And that's good, okay? If you look back in history, there have been hundreds of jobs that have disappeared because of the arrival of technology. One of my favorites, for example, there used to be someone in the 19th century who had the enviable title, now don't get excited because it's not what you think, they had the enviable title of a knocker-upper, all right? Great name. Knocker-upper's job was to walk around with a long stick that looked like a fishing pole. And when it was time for you to get up to go to work at the factory, they would come and bang on your second or third or fourth floor window to wake you up. Well, We have iPhones now. We don't need knocker-uppers anymore. We also don't need rat catchers, and we don't need lectors, the people that used to stand in the middle of a factory floor with a newspaper and a megaphone and read the paper to the workers to keep them from getting bored, okay? We have earbuds for that now. We don't need lamplighters anymore. All of these jobs have gone away, but with their disappearance, in every single case, we've seen the creation of a whole new set of jobs that actually are more skilled, more capable, and in greater demand. So is that a concern? Yeah, it's always a concern. But if we manage it properly, and this is the human side of it, this is why I'm less concerned about the technology, more concerned about humans, it'll be fine. We'll be able to overcome any downsides. But from a technological point of view, I don't worry about it. I always worry about what people do with it. That's always the danger. You know, it's not the technology itself. You know, it's the argument that says that you know, computers and networks don't fail ever. Yeah, things burn out, right? But when you get a security breach, it's not the computer's fault. 100% of the time, it's a person. It's somebody that did something stupid or somebody that did something where they weren't aware that what they did was wrong. It's always the case. So, you know, we have to kind of manage our own house before we point fingers at the technology itself. That's a really good question, really important one.
Hi, Steve. We're going to hold the rest of the questions to the end of your presentation.
Okay, I've only got 2 more slides and then we can go as long as you like. All right, so let's move into the domain of better life through chemistry. All right, you might well, never mind. You remember back in the days when atoms looked like that drawing over there on the upper left-hand corner? You know, this was the 1950s, and that's what an atom looked like. And then as we began to better understand what physics was and how quantum technology worked and so on, instead of saying, well, the electron is in that location right there, we started to develop these things called orbitals that said, no, we never really know where it is. What we know is that it's somewhere in this particular shape. It might be a sphere, or it might be shaped like a dumbbell. I mean, there are all these different shapes. Well, that was because of, you know, our old friend Heisenberg, right? Not the guy from Breaking Bad, but the guy he's named after, the uncertainty theory, okay? Well, we have a new form of computing that is starting to arrive, and it's called quantum computing. And I got to tell you, I don't know what kind of better life through chemistry the people that designed these things were using, but it was good. You're looking at one of those computers. This strange steampunk looking machine on the screen is a quantum computer. Basically, the way they work is as follows. In traditional digital technology, digital computers, the word digital literally means discrete because they have 2 states. Every every bit, which is a contraction of binary digit. Binary means 2 states, 2 discrete states. It's either a 0 or a 1. It's either on or it's off. It's either a high frequency or a low frequency. It's either a loud signal or a quiet signal. Okay, that's a binary digital computer. Quantum computers, instead of using bits, they use something called quantum bits or qubits. And the thing about a qubit is that the way these things work is they take advantage of quantum physics, right? We don't know what the state of the bit is. The bit can either be a 0 or a 1 or both at any point in time. And as a result of this, we have the ability now to basically use statistical modeling to determine the information that the computer is telling us. What you're seeing here is the actual computer, the brains of the computer. This thing gets immersed in liquid nitrogen, which cools it down to about, I don't even remember, a couple of 100 degrees below 0. And the reason they do that is because it slows the processing down enough that they can actually measure what's going on, okay? This technology is going to fundamentally change things like security. So the earlier question about whether we become less secure as these technologies advance, no, because at the same time that those technologies advance, technologies like these, which are building the ability to secure systems, are also being developed. Now, these machines are still very much in the experimental phase. There aren't many of them. There were something like, I actually don't know, but I'm going to guess there might be 10 or 15 of them on the planet. IBM owns quite a few of them. And in fact, IBM has, I believe, 3 of them connected to the internet, and anyone that wants can use them. So if you're interested in this stuff and you have the programming ability, you can actually go in and use their machines free of charge. There, you just log on and run your program or whatever it is on the machines. My point is that it's not to cause you to want to run out to Best Buy and buy a quantum computer, because you can't. I just want you to understand just how sophisticated and advanced these technologies are because of what humanity is capable of doing. And on that note, let me take you to my very last slide. The Age of Wonder is one of the best books I've read in a very, very long time. And the reason is because it's an exploration of the early days of science. But more important than that, it showed me something that I hope you pulled out of this presentation, and that is the following. There was a woman named Ada Lovelace. Ada Lovelace was very close friends with a guy named Charles Babbage. Charles Babbage built a computer, an early computer that never really worked, called the difference engine. But Ada Lovelace got a hold of it. And she looked at it and said, you know, if you make a few tweaks here and there, we might be able to make this thing work. And she did. She was able to make it. So she is known to this day as the person who built the world's first computer. But Ada Lovelace was also the daughter of Lord Byron, which is kind of interesting. Okay. And Lord Byron, the poet, was best friends with a guy named William Herschel. William Herschel was an astronomer in the 19th century who built, or the 18th century rather, who built the world's largest telescopes, big reflector telescopes in England. Then there was a guy named Humphrey Davy who discovered the properties of gases, and he discovered nitrous oxide. He was a chemist. And his best friend was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, who wrote the poem Kubla Khan. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. And then we have Michael Faraday, the guy that invented the electric motor, who by night was a gifted poet. And we have John Keats, who wrote Ode on a Grecian Urn, who was also a medical student. And we have Mary Shelley, who was a physician. Mary Shelley, the physician, who was also an author who wrote Frankenstein. And Mary Shelley, the physician, was married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet, who wrote, among other things, Ozymandias. My point with this, folks, is that the reason that these people were able to all do the things they did was because they tended to hang out with people that forced them to exercise the other side of their brains. The poets became better at marveling at the natural world because they hung out with people who actually understood it. And the scientists who tried to make sense of the technologies they were developing tempered their understanding by talking to the poets and the authors and the artists that they hung out with. This to me is really, really important, and it demonstrates the consilience of science and the humanities and the fact that we need both. So I bring this up only because I want you to understand that this is not about technology, this is about how we use it. Technology is only a good thing if it in some way enables human behavior, human capacity, human capability. And that's the reason I wanted to talk to you about this today. So on that note, let me go to the last slide, and I will turn this back over to they who must be obeyed, who run this place, and we'll figure out what our next questions are if we have time.
Yes, Steve, it looks like we have time for a couple more questions.
Good.
Can you please speak on the positive and negatives for automation and your thoughts for the future?
Sure. So that's a great question. I do a lot of work in the world of automation. The thing about automation is that automation implies a task that gets repeated over and over and over and over and over and over again. It must be done exactly and correctly the same way every single time, which you'll never get from humans. It's not going to work. People get tired, they get repetitive stress injuries, they get bored. As soon as that happens, they stop performing at a high level. So in a job like that, we want to turn that over to a machine. We want a person running the machine, designing the machine, maintaining the machine, fixing it when it's broken, and so on. But that's sort of the sort of two sides. Now, looking at all these technologies we've talked about, the thing about automation is it implies robotic processes, okay? And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But robotic processes only work if you also have them connected over a network that facilitates signal delivery to those robots in a very precise, very repeatable, very predictable way. And that information that's going to those robots is only good if it's being collected in a timely fashion and delivered. That implies IoT. And Internet of Things, of course, implies that you've designed the systems in such a way that you've instrumented them for the proper and accurate collection of data. The reason I'm telling you this is because one of the complaints I hear people say a lot about things like automation is that, well, yeah, we're going to displace all these people doing these jobs and replace them with robots, but I only need one person to run 40 robots. That may be true, but you need more than one person to do the IoT, to do the networking, to do the computing, to do the analytics, to debug the analytics, to write the Python programs that make it work, and all those other incremental positions, many of which haven't even been invented yet. So I tend to look at this very much from a realistic perspective. Yes, it's going to have an impact on jobs, but it's also going to have an upward impact on jobs as jobs that require greater skills and so on become available. And that's where, frankly, education becomes fundamentally important, because we have to teach people how to do these things, okay? And I think we're going to see an interesting convergence of how do I say this, traditional training or education that comes out of universities. And I think we're going to see a renaissance in interest and need for the trades. I think that, you know, the so-called blue collar jobs that people tend to disparage are going to become blue sky jobs because of the need for them to do a lot of these very sophisticated tasks in the future. It's going to be an interesting thing to watch.
All right, Steve, this is our last question.
Okay.
Lately, we have had some of the biggest maritime shipping line systems kidnapped and blocked for weeks. Are we all in risk of having all our data kidnapped and asked to send Bitcoins to have a password to unfreeze it?
That's a great question. Well, this year alone, there have been 4 major hacks of the 4 biggest shipping companies in the world. And the danger, of course, is that in at least one case, it was a maritime ransomware attack, and the ransomware attacks are the ones where they basically hold your data hostage. What we often tell organizations is that getting hacked is not an if question, it's a when question. And the degree to which you take steps to protect yourself is fundamentally important. So for example, as an individual, if you haven't implemented things like dual level security, where you log in, hit enter, and it says, okay, I'm going to open up a new window. Now enter the 6 digits that appear on your mobile phone. If you haven't done that, do it now. Do it right now. That kind of thing takes a little bit more time, but it raises the ability to protect against attacks to an extraordinarily high level. The biggest issue we have with the maritime world or any other world in terms of being attacked, whether it's a denial of service attack or some sort of a spam attack or a ransomware attack, is complacency. And it goes back to people. The systems are only as safe as we make them. And what we've found in a lot of these organizations, and maritime is a good example, is that these organizations have simply not taken the steps necessary to truly protect their IT assets. And it's not that they're stupid, it's not that they're lazy, it's that in many cases they simply don't know. They just assume that everything is well protected. And the problem is that the people that are attacking these systems are becoming increasingly skilled, increasingly capable, and increasingly motivated. Sometimes it's just because they want to break in, sometimes it's financial, they're crooks, sometimes it's political. It doesn't matter what the reason is. We need to take every step possible to secure these assets across the board. Now, just so you know, and it's available to anybody that wants it, just in the last 2 days, my colleague Gary Kessler and I did a podcast about this very topic, and it's available on my podcast. I'll make sure that Emory knows how to get to it. And I've written quite a bit about this as well. So all you have to do is either reach out to me and I'll let you know, or reach out to Emory and we'll show you how to get to that information. So no, I don't think we're at any higher risk, but we're at risk. And we just need to make sure that we're taking those sort of cybersecurity 101 steps to do everything we can to reduce that risk. Good question.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
This has been an amazing presentation, and I think we've had a lot of people who have expressed that they have loved this as well. We really appreciate everybody taking time to join us today for Business Over Breakfast, and as always, we appreciate your insights and your thoughts. A recording of today's session will be available on the Emory Executive Education LinkedIn page, and you can also find that link in the chat. Next Thursday, Richard Berlin is going to be joining us for our Business Over Breakfast, and we'll be talking about leading change in turbulent times. We hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. If you want more, we always have a slate of short courses available, and there are still several before the end of the calendar year. If you would like to register or get more information on any of these, please visit our website and reach out. We'd be happy to talk with you more. We're going to have a brief survey pop up on your screen here in a second to get your feedback on today's session. It's really valuable to us and will take only 1 to 2 minutes to complete, so we hope that you will take some time to fill that out. With that, Steve, I'm going to turn it back over to you for any closing remarks.
Absolutely, folks. The only closing remarks I have for you is that, as I said earlier, well, I didn't say earlier, I write a lot about this stuff. I read a lot of books and so on. And so I only tell you that because I collect a lot of data on all of these topics. And I should probably be very clear, I am not an engineer. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm an industry analyst, and I look at these technologies, and therefore I have to understand them in order to understand how they apply to business. So just so you know, I can't help you program your Python, your application. However, I do collect a lot of data about this stuff. Anything you need, if all you have to do is reach out to either the folks at Emory or reach out to me on my email there, and I will be happy to come back to you with additional information. Anything at all that would be helpful to you, just let me know. Happy to do it. Thank you very much for joining us today. Hope you found it useful, and look forward to hearing from some of you and maybe seeing you in an Emory program one of these days.